So how do we empower the social sciences? Well, we could give everybody here a lot more money and discretion, and they could work really hard. And yeah, there's a long list of pretty obvious things. Okay, we should absolutely do all of those things. But what is the secret sauce? How does it actually happen? I think the secret sauce involves three things, and I made an icon for each one. It's connections, and it's methods, and it's questions. It's new connections and new methods and new questions. I'm going to explain each one. For connections, well, we want to share data and people and expertise. For expertise, you can hire in government people that I could never hire, and the industry could never hire. And industry could hire people that neither of us could ever hire, and I could hire people that neither government nor industry could hire. But when we share expertise, when there is a flow of information back and forth across these different types of people, focusing on different problems and focusing on them in different ways with different types of access and resources, we all get better. So it's not only expertise in cooperation, it is also data. So in the social sciences, we have had more data than ever before, and it increases fast, and that has created spectacular discoveries and enormous progress. However, even though we have more data than ever before, we have a smaller fraction of the data in the world than ever before, because most of it is tied up inside private companies, sometimes inside governments, and sometimes inside academia. And if we can learn to share data, we can also make serious progress, just as when we share expertise. That's connections. What about methods? The main thing I want to convey about methods and about the title of the conference, which is the Big Data Revolution, is that big data is not about the data. After all, there's lots of data around. There's more data than ever before. There should be more. And as I said, a lot of it's tied up inside organizations that we don't have access to but could. But data by itself doesn't produce progress. For example, there were 750 million social media posts that were written today and are available on the web for scholarly analysis. We could download them. But what are you supposed to do with all that information? Write them on index cards and read them? It's impossible. It's physically impossible to read them. It's not a particularly good methodology to plan to read them. Now suppose there's a billion a day, which is going to happen sometime. Does that make it any easier? No. More data just makes it more of a pain for those of us who analyze data. So what makes progress? What makes progress is you guys. It's you. It's me. It's the analysts. It's the new methods. It's the existing methods. That's what provides the value. That's the revolution. That's the big data revolution. Big data is not about the data, it's about the analytics, and it's about the people turning the analytics into actionable insight. Third are the questions. So not just any questions, but new questions. There needs to be enough flexibility for those of us, you and me, analyzing data to have enough elbow room to ask different questions than were set out originally. So science is not only about asking very specific questions that we began ahead of time with. It's also about coming up with brand new questions. I would say the most important methodological advice I give on a regular basis is someone walks into my office and says, I have this very specific question, this methodological problem. How do I fix it? Where's the button in SPSS I can push to get rid of endogeneity or omitted variable bias? Well, first of all, there is no button. Second of all, that's not even a question, right? Like it doesn't, the premises don't make any sense. There's no way we could answer the question because the question doesn't make sense. Instead, what you do is you say, you know what? You think you're interested in this question, but that's not coherent. Here's actually something in your data that I think would be of interest to you that you could answer that doesn't have any of the methodological problems that you did originally. And you know what? Nobody was interested in that question before, but you might be, and you might be able to make enormous progress by going after it. So I think we make terrific connections across sectors. That's the first piece. We focus on the the methods that we have that turn data into actionable insights. And then we give the methodologists, the data analysts, the people analyzing big data, small data, whatever kind of data you have, enough flexibility to be able to change their mind, to be able to learn from the data. Data are not there only to answer questions. They're all there. They're also there, it turns out, to suggest new questions to us that never even occurred to us before. So I'm going to focus on these three things throughout my examples. Okay, connections, methods, and questions, and those three little icons. And now I'm going to tell you some stories from my research that I'm really thrilled that I got to be part of. The examples go across the world, in Mexico and in China and the United States and in Italy, and then some global infrastructural issues that we'll talk about as well. Okay, so let's get started. So the first story I want to tell you is about the Mexican Universal Healthcare Insurance Program evaluation that I got to do. This evaluation was of Seguro Popular. That was the name of the program. It provided healthcare for the first time to 50 million Mexicans. It was an enormous project. It was the largest healthcare policy intervention in any country in the world in at least 2 decades. And I got to evaluate it in a really cool way that I'm going to describe to you. So first question is, how did we get to do this, right? Well, the government asked, how does one democratically elected government tie the hands of the next democratically elected government? That's what they wanted to know. In Mexico, it's not that they weren't afraid of losing the election. There's term limits. There was not going to be an election that they could participate in. And they were implementing this program that they really believed in, and they wanted it to continue. And so what were they going to do? So their theory was what? What was their answer? Their answer was collaboration. Right. So so they're going to benefit from collaboration. In what way? So they're going to commission an independent evaluation. Some guy at Harvard was going to get to run this evaluation, make all the decisions about how the evaluation was going to be implemented, and make the conclusion about whether the program was succeeding or not entirely by himself. This guy at Harvard, not a Mexican, he didn't even really speak Spanish. Okay, so why would they do this? They did this because if you give the ability to someone else to actually say it didn't work, and he actually concludes that it did work, then that's actually a useful piece of information, and it might at least make it somewhat more difficult for the next government to turn it down. Okay, to kill the program. Right. That's all. That was their idea. And at worst, they'd be able to figure out what happened with the program. And of course, I asked them like 35 times if the program is a failure, or if our study shows it's a failure, I'm going to say that publicly, right? And they said right like 35 times, and that was okay. And so I believed them, and that's where we were. So our study, which of course took like 2 years of legal negotiations to get exactly right, gave me the ability to implement whatever I wanted. What we wound up doing was randomizing the program to communities. We randomized hospitals, like literally you flipped coins, heads you got a hospital in this community and not. But in addition, doctors and medicines and insurance and money to pay for it all. They did advertising. They people had to affiliate to the program for the federal government to give the money to the state governments, so the state governments would implement the program. They'd convince the federal government that they brought their hospitals up to par. Then the money would flow from the federal government to the state governments. It was quite an enormous program and an enormous evaluation as well. It was, in the end, the largest health policy randomized experiment ever conducted. There was a problem, though. The problem is, when we looked at prior research, we found that most large evaluations of public policy programs fail. And they mostly fail because politicians intervene. In Mexico, in the previous experiment, which was an anti-poverty program, the governors of some of the states in the control group, the people who were not going to get the program, they miraculously found enough money for the people in the control group to also receive the program. Isn't that great? Well, in a democracy, you're allowed to do what you want if you're a politician, and so that may be a good thing. But from a scientific point of view, of course, it ruined the experiment. Now, it was okay with me that the program would be evaluated as a failure if it was, but it wasn't okay with me that the evaluation was a failure. So I had to make sure that this was not going to happen. Now, how do we do that? Well, we could try to convince the politicians not to be politicians. How well would that work, right? So instead what we did is add some methods, some novel methods. And what we did is we came up with a politically robust, fail-safe design. So if the politicians do what politicians are going to do, then the randomization in this design would continue. It wouldn't involve additional assumptions. So I'll explain how it works. So normally, a randomized experiment, or classically a randomized experiment, is you take each person, or in this case, each community, and you flip one coin, and heads, they get the treatment, and tails, they get the control. So heads, they would get all the hospitals and medicines and everything. Tails, they wouldn't get anything. But instead, we used a matched pair design. A matched pair design works like this. You take two communities, or two people, whatever it is, but in this case communities, and you match them. So you take one community, you find another community that is as similar as possible on all the measurable characteristics: prior health care, infrastructure, income, prior health status, etc. We match communities in pairs, and instead of flipping one coin for each community, we flip one coin for each pair. For the first pair, if it's heads, this one gets it, this one doesn't. If it's tails, this one gets it, and this one doesn't. Turns out there was a whole literature in public health that was arguing that you should never do a matched pair experiment. It's biased, it's inefficient. So we had to prove that that was all wrong, and it was all wrong. In fact, a matched pair experiment has lower bias, lower model dependence, which means if you run different statistical models, you're going to get very different results. Without model dependence, you get roughly the same results. So with a matched pair experiment, you have much lower levels of model dependence. You have way lower research costs. And in fact, your uncertainty estimates are much, much lower. We figured out in this experiment that we ran, which we ran with a matched pair design, we were able to estimate how big our standard errors would be if we had run it with complete randomization, one coin flip per community. And it turns out that our standard errors would have been as much as 6 times larger. So that's an enormous difference, just methodologically. We wound up saving millions and millions of dollars, well, in this case, millions and millions of pesos, and being able to extend the evaluation across more of the country. So the results, just to give you a feel for it, the main outcome was healthcare impoverishment. So this was trying to get money to people to make sure that they were not impoverished by healthcare. What would happen is somebody in your family would get sick, and then you'd have to pack them up, put them in some kind of vehicle, track them off for days to a hospital, and then shell out cash to the hospital. More than a third of your disposable income was how we defined catastrophic healthcare spending. That was drastically reduced, so it was actually quite a successful program. But then we had discretion. Then we changed the question. The question we were asked was healthcare impoverishment. Was it reduced? But we also asked a new question because the data suggested something. Let me explain. So states qualify for federal funding under this program by automatically signing up the poor. For everybody else that wasn't the poorest of the poor, those people had to sign up themselves. And when they signed up themselves, they, of course, knew they signed up because they had to do this. The poor were automatically signed up. And if they were automatically signed up, then an interesting thing happened. We discovered that 66%, only 66% of the poor were aware that they had health care. So what the states were basically doing is they were telling the federal government that they had affiliated all these people to the program, built their hospitals up to par, and then they said, and those were the conditions under which the federal government would flow money to that state. But the state didn't really tell all the poor people that they had the program. And so they would get the money and they wouldn't have to spend it on the program. So what happened? We literally just told them about this. The federal government said to the states that were doing this, and that's it. Our data show it just stopped right away. So by changing the question, by asking a question that we weren't asked, a really cool thing happened. We got millions of people, additional people, healthcare. That was it. We just asked a question that wasn't asked. It wasn't even part of the randomized experiment. It was in the data, but not part of the experiment, and not what we set out to do originally. So in this study, you can see there was collaboration, which was essential. There were new methods. These were really old methods that people had concluded were not any good. So we basically showed that they were. And finally, it was brand new questions that didn't occur to anybody, either the Mexican government or us originally. And so those were the pieces. And then there are these cool externalities because the same design is now being implemented in large-scale policy evaluations around the world. So the next project is on reverse engineering censorship in China. The interesting thing is, when we started to do this study, we didn't intend to study China. We didn't intend to study censorship, and we weren't reverse engineering anything. So how did we get to do this? Is a reasonable question. So we was Molly Roberts and Jen Pan, two of my then graduate students. Molly's at UCSD and Jen is at Stanford now. So we had a method of automated text analysis that we were using in English. And we thought, let's take this method and improve it. How do we improve it? Well, we'll push it until it breaks, and then we'll figure out how it breaks, and then we'll fix that up, and we'll keep going. We thought maybe we could write a paper on automated text analysis. But it happened that Molly and Jen both spoke Chinese, and so I thought, a really good way of pushing it until it breaks is trying this method in a language which we didn't design it for, because Chinese obviously works very differently. And so we're going to basically try a method. That's what, there's the little end there. That's basically what it is. So the next step is, well, where are we going to get Chinese language social media posts? As it happens, I had founded a company which is now called Brandwatch. And what they do is they go around the world, they collect publicly available social media posts, and they provide brand monitoring to companies and governments and various others. So we went to Brandwatch, collaboration, right? We get another little icon there. We went to Brandwatch, we downloaded a database of social media posts and the URL from which each came, and we started analyzing the data. And when we did that, we noticed that we were able to push forward the method because we found places that it didn't work in Chinese, and so we improved it, et cetera. And then before we wrote up a paper on automated text analysis, maybe even automated text analysis in Chinese, I said to Molly and Jen, hey, why don't you go click on some of the URLs that came with the data and just understand the context of where the data came from. And they did that, and they came back to my office, and they said, Gary, there's something wrong with the data from Brandwatch, because sometimes we click on the post, and it goes back to the website, but other times we click on the post, it doesn't go anywhere. And so I said, show me. So we go to the computer in my office, and we're clicking on the post, and we see those two types of behavior. The second one is it looks like a Chinese version of Facebook. They don't have Facebook there, but they have plenty of other social media companies. And so I'm clicking and clicking. I see both of those behaviors. We keep doing it until at one point it says, this post is being investigated. And I literally said, well, who investigates social media posts? Why does that make any sense, right? And of course, it's the Chinese government. That's who investigates social media posts, right? It's crazy, right? That's who was doing it. And we realized, wait a second. So we had the entire corpus of Chinese language social media posts that the Chinese people couldn't read because they weren't allowed to, but we could. And I thought, let's forget that paper on automated text analysis, right? And so we click one more time and we change the question. So all of a sudden we decide to go after this question, which is a completely different question. All right, so we then went and looked and said, how do people study censorship? Here's how they studied censorship. They would watch a few posts, find one that was censored, make up a whole story. You see it in the media all the time, even today, about what's removed. What we do instead is we can download all social media posts in China that are publicly available before the Chinese censors can read them and decide what to censor. And then we can figure it out. Okay, we can figure out what they're censoring. So let's start with what they're censoring. So everybody knows the goal of censorship, right? It's sort of the obvious goal. They want to stop criticism and protest about the state, the leaders, and their policies. And the first thing we learned about this is we took the pile of censored posts, for which we had the content, right? And the pile of uncensored posts, and we saw how much criticism, protest there was about the state, the leaders, and the policies, and the two, and basically it was the same. It was almost the same. We could barely see the difference. So the thing that everybody knew was the goal was just utterly and completely wrong. Okay, well that's interesting. Okay, so what's going on? All right, how do we look at this? We look through different lenses to try to figure out what was going on, and we finally asked the question in a different way. We asked, what could be the goal? Well, it could be to stop criticism of the state, or it could be to stop collective action, to stop protest. And we looked at it that way, and when we compared it to the data and we tried to figure out whether the censored posts were doing more or less than the other, we found that the first was wrong and the second was right. Let me make this clear. So if you say in China, or at least when we looked, if you say the leaders of this town are all stealing money, here's how much, it's in overseas bank accounts, those are the bank accounts, and by the way, they all have mistresses, that won't be censored. But if you say, and let's go protest, that will be censored. They don't care what you can do, they only care, I'm sorry, they don't care what you think of them, they only care what you can do. In fact, if you say the leaders of this other town are doing such a great job, let's have a rally in their favor, censored, right? They don't care what you think of them, they are a bunch of dictators, what should you think of them? It's just not really important to them. What is important to them is whether you can move people. If you have the power to move people, they will stop you. And that's what we found, which we thought was pretty cool. But it's not only just cool and interesting, which was sufficient for me, but in addition, it's actionable. It's actionable for the Chinese leaders, and it's actionable for us because we can use it to predict things. For the Chinese leaders, they use this to measure criticism, to judge local officials, because the criticism on the web is not censored. So therefore, they can use it to figure out who's not liked by the local leaders and who might then allow protests to happen because the people are really upset. And if the protest happens in that local area, then it might contagiously go from local area to local area, and the main, the leaders of the country might then lose their position. So they use criticism to judge local leaders, and we can see that the local leaders get taken out if there's enough criticism. And then, of course, they use censorship to stop events with collective action potential, with the potential to move people. Interestingly, because the Chinese leaders can use social media, we can use it also. We can and have used censorship behavior to predict which local officials are in trouble and likely to be replaced. We've predicted dissident arrests before they happened. We've predicted new peace treaties before they were signed, emerging scandals, all kinds of interesting things. Disagreements between central leaders and local leaders, which you can't really see otherwise. There's lots of information available in these data that are not available in the media, in anywhere else. So let me tell you one more story about China. These are about finding those people who are hiding in plain sight. So in Chinese social media, if you use this word, it gets censored. What word is that? Some of you know. It's freedom. So that's censored. Not all websites, but some websites will censor it automatically. Here's another word. It looks almost the same thing for non-Chinese speakers. It looks exactly the same, but of course, a few little changes. What does it mean now? It means I field. An I and a field, it doesn't really have any meaning at all. It's completely nonsensical. But it's a homograph. What that means is people will say, we need more I fields in China. And what does that mean? That means if you understand what's going on, if you understand what's being conveyed by the author, it means the same thing as freedom. The censors miss it, but of course people can follow it. We, however, can't be misled. We have to be able to follow the conversation. So we develop technology to help us follow the conversation where the censors can't. Here's another example, which is pretty cool. So this word means the harmonious society, which is the official slogan of the Chinese Communist Party. That's censored because they don't want you talking about that. Not all the time, but in some websites it's automatically censored. Here's another word. It looks completely different. It means river crab, which is utterly irrelevant, but it sounds the same. It's a homophone. And so if you say that a river crab is really wrong, then people understand what it means, and the automated censors anyway will miss it. The human censors will not miss it, but the automated censors will. So we developed this technology where the censors can't follow the conversation, but we can. And then we changed the question. And when you change the question, it turns out there's lots of other applications. And when we did that, we created a startup company called Thresher that sells these services to commercial clients, and they can go after all kinds of other interesting questions, like what analysts do in trying to follow social media, as I just described, or e-discovery if somebody's committing fraud. They don't use the word fraud. Long tail search, only 15% of all Google searches have never been searched for before, and so you can't use previous patterns of what you click on to tell the Google search engine or Bing search engine what the right one is. A few years ago during the Boston bombings, we were all hunkered down trying to figure out what was going on. The media didn't know anything. So we'd look at Twitter and people would use hashtag Boston bombings. Well, at some point during the conversation, people wanted to express the community spirit, and they switched hashtag Boston bombings to hashtag Boston strong. And then, of course, if you were just using the search, you'd lose the thread of the conversation. And so lots of examples like this, we can use this kind of technology to make a lot of progress. So that was China. We did Mexico. Now we're going to do the United States. Last one's Italy. Ready? So what's the effect of the news media? Everybody wants to know. Everybody thinks it's big, but what's really the evidence? So the real big problem is we can't randomize. We can't tell the New York Times what to publish and when. There have been, over many years, lots of clever alternatives. Someone noticed they're building a new TV tower. And if you live behind a hill, then you don't get TV. But if you live right next to the hill, then maybe you do get TV. So because if you're in the radio shadow, you wouldn't necessarily get it. And maybe those two communities were similar enough and you can figure out what the effect is. That's a pretty cool idea. You can look at the effect on opinion or the agenda of surprise media events. There's lots of really neat, clever alternatives. But as the literature has concluded, these often produce profound biases. Biases as much as 600% different from the truth. That's a different 600% than I showed you earlier. But huge is a better calibration here. It's just a real problem. Moreover, the thing you're estimating, even if the bias isn't big, is often different. So maybe the people behind the hill are poor, and the people not behind the hill are rich, or maybe one is politically privileged and not the other. That would create bias. If actually they are the same before the TV tower was built, and so it's a good controlled experiment, that's great. You can estimate the effect of the media. However, if you do that, you're still estimating the effect for the people behind the hill minus the people near the hill. That's not the same as the effect for the whole country. So it's always a problem. What we did is switch the question. Instead of using the question that everybody tried to answer, like behind the hill or not behind the hill, we switched back to the original question. So Ben Schneer and Ariel White, two of my graduate students, now at Harvard, the Harvard Kennedy School and MIT, came into my office and they were just starting graduate school, and I said, hey, Ben and Ariel, let's do this study. I think maybe we could do it, but let's ask the right question. We're going to change the question by asking the question that everybody wanted to ask, but nobody could. That is, what's the effect of the media overall? Let's just try to do it the right way. You're just starting graduate school. We'll finish before you finish graduate school. And I missed by about 6 months, but they've done well, so it's okay. All right, so what's required to randomize the media? Well, for journalists, to have journalistic integrity, they need total control over what's published and when. That's what journalistic integrity is. Okay, what about for the scientists, for us? What we need is total control over what's published and when, because if we're randomizing or doing something else, we have to control that. That's what it is. So no problem here. We just have to get an agreement from two groups that want exactly the same thing. But we figured, let's do it. So we made a partnership. We made a collaboration. The collaboration, of course, was with the journalists. We convinced 48 media outlets to work with us, to let us randomize. We did it in a way that was okay with them, that was incentive compatible with them, that was okay with us, that was incentive compatible for us. These are some of the outlets. They were smallish media outlets. The Progressive, which has about 50,000 subscribers, was the median outlet. And there are lots of others. So these 48 media outlets, what we did is we worked it out in the following way. We, the social scientists, choose the policy area. There were 11, we choose one of them. We make the total decision here. Then we have a group of volunteers among our 48 outlets who wish to write articles within that policy area. We choose about 3 of them. And we follow a protocol that they're accustomed to following. We studied them, the journalists, and we talked to them, and we understood their situation and how they go about their standard business. And we tried to modify what they did in as minimal a way as possible, so it was possible to convince them to do what it is we wanted them to do. There is a project manager protocol, it's called. You may have heard of the Panama Papers, where different media outlets get together, they share information, and then they agree not to publish until a particular date when they all publish their separate articles. And that's the project manager protocol. That's what we did here. So the outlets would volunteer to be in a pack, like pack journalism, a group of journalists. They had to volunteer, but if an outlet proposed joining a pack that was an expert in that area, we wouldn't choose them. We would eliminate them from the experiment. We would have total control. But of course, they could still publish. They could still collaborate. They could still have their project manager protocol. They could do what they want. They just wouldn't be part of the experiment. So we get total control and they get total control. That's the key. Then the PAC chooses a specific subject within the broad policy area to write articles on. And they collaborate. They follow their normal protocol. When they choose the subject, if the subject is not within the policy area, we reject it. They can't be part of the experiment. But they can still do what they want to do. They can still publish. So we get 100% of what we want. They get 100% of what they want. There's lots of other features of this protocol, but that's basically the story. We find ways of doing what otherwise would have seemed impossible by understanding each other's incentives and making it right for everybody. We made sure there was no breaking news, because breaking news couldn't be assigned to a particular time when we would randomize that story to go. And so if somebody wanted to write on breaking news, they could, but it wouldn't be part of the experiment. We then used match pair randomization, which I told you about earlier. Only now what we did is we matched weeks based upon similar levels of predicted news. So if Obama, which was when we were running this study, was going to give a speech on a specific subject, which we usually knew about ahead of time, and that subject was the one that we were running our experiment about, we would just exclude it. That wouldn't be one of the weeks. So we'd pick weeks. Turns out most news is actually quite predictable. The jobs report is going to come out on a particular day, et cetera. So we match weeks based upon similarity of predicted news. We have one coin flip to choose weeks. If it's heads, it's this week. If it's tails, it's this week. And the control week, ideally, they wouldn't run anything special in this area. So the treatment week, they publish and promote articles, usually on a Tuesday. The control week, no compensation or special actions. The outlets in the pack would all publish simultaneously, following their usual procedures. That's the way it worked. We then also introduced some statistical methods, some new statistical methods to this area that made it possible to do what we were doing. So we get another little M there. We did sequential hypothesis testing. So the idea here is, normally what you do when you do a study is you do power calculations and you figure out how many observations do you need to do that study. But if you miscalculate, and there's a lot of assumptions in making power calculations, if you miscalculate, you might collect way more data than you needed, which would have cost a lot more money than necessary. And similarly, if you collect too little information, then you don't get anything at all because the confidence intervals are so large that you can't learn anything. Well, it turns out that in this literature, people had concluded that if you didn't collect enough information, what you needed to do was throw away all the data and start from scratch and do another power calculation. That was utterly wrong and a total waste of time and a huge waste of money. So we had to prove that sequential hypothesis testing was actually fine. You run the experiment, collect a few observations, run your analysis. If the confidence intervals are too big, run it again, include some more data. The confidence intervals would get narrower, it would keep going. You're allowed to look at the results. It won't bias anything. The confidence intervals will get smaller and smaller. They won't produce the results that you necessarily want, but your certainty about the results will get more and more narrow. So sequential hypothesis testing will enable us, and enabled us in this experiment, to collect just as much data as we needed. We then developed some methods and used some methods of automated text analysis to measure the national conversation in social media. So millions and millions of social media posts. So let me give you a feel for what the results were. The causal effects were of randomly assigning these three outlets was a huge effect. The 19% increase in discussing that general policy area, not the specific subject about which the analyst chose. So if the big subject is jobs, if the big policy area is jobs, the specific subject might be Uber drivers losing their jobs in Philadelphia to automated cars. Right? So they write about that specific thing. We measure it based upon the big thing, and the national conversation about jobs would increase, according to our randomized experiment, by 19%. And more over the subsequent days. It would be less each day, but if you add them all up, it was a 62.7% increase. So the context here is 3 small media outlets have a huge effect on the national conversation. And the national conversation, we know, has a big effect on the policy agenda, what members of Congress and others discuss. And the policy agenda, if you control the policy agenda, that has at least an impact on policy. And so this is the effect of the media, which actually turns out to be quite large. So the last topic for today, the last place we're going to visit is Italy. So in Italy, I got to do a really neat study of designing COVID-19 public health messaging. Early on in the COVID crisis, I mean, like right at the beginning of March, we had a collaboration. And the collaboration came from the Italian government. They called me up and they said, we have an urgent need to figure out messaging to convince everybody to follow the public health advice. I mean, it was an incredibly urgent call. I would say frenetic was a good description, and I don't know how you translate that into Italian, but my Italian isn't as good as my Spanish, so who knows what they were saying, but you could hear what they were conveying, which was an incredible sense of urgency. We really need to figure this out. There were a lot of people dying. If you remember, that was the center of COVID at that time. Well, interestingly, one of the benefits of COVID, one of the side effects of COVID is collaboration. Because the whole world really wants to solve this problem. And you ask people to give of their information, they give it. You ask academics to contribute, they contribute it. You ask lots of people in governments, they provide it. And so we took advantage of that in developing these collaborations. In 5 days, the following cool things happened. We, in response to the request from the Italian government, we took on this task to design experiments to figure out what their messaging to the Italian public should be. We signed up 20 academic collaborators, instantly. Each one had different specialties, and we needed them all because we needed to get a result right away. This wasn't a project that would take a year or two, as our normal academic projects on our normal academic timeline usually takes. We also, within the 5 days, designed a large-scale experiment. We pre-tested the experiment by running small versions of it in multiple cities around Italy. We ran a nationally representative survey, I think the first or one of the first in the COVID crisis. We randomized messaging, different types of messaging that we knew from the social psychological literature were likely to influence people, but there were several versions of it. And so we randomized to see what the effect would be. We measured compliance with the public health messaging. We completed the analyses. We wrote a complete academic paper, and we made it public on day 5. I'll give you a feel for the results. The results that came from this collaboration. The public health messaging was working. It really was working. People understood it. There was high compliance for all subgroups, including the young who complied the least. We're still at 80% or so compliance, or adherence, as they like to say now in public health. Even those who distrust the government were doing what the government said. Even those who reported that the government was lying to them about the COVID crisis were doing what the government said. That's completely different, of course, than the United States now, which has politicized this messaging. Well, at least in Italy at the time, they figured out that that was not going to be what they were going to do. They were going to try to figure this out. It was really a big crisis, and they responded to it. We then got to change the question. So, like everything I'm trying to tell you, there's a collaboration, there's methods. Here we didn't develop new methods, but we used a lot of the existing ones. And then they gave us enough elbow room so that we could see what the data suggested in terms of new questions to go after. And then what we found, what we thought of was, wait a second, we're putting everybody in quarantine. Now, as I say this, it's been 6 months. We've been at least partially locked down for 6 months, but right then it was right at the beginning. And and in Italy, the lockdown was much more serious. You had to have a written piece of paper with your signature on it in order to leave your house. And so we thought that the impact of that on people's mental health would be serious. We studied it. We showed that there was an effect. We designed treatments, things that the government could do to improve the mental health of people, to make it so that they, even though they were following the advice now, would they still be following it for as long as necessary to bring down the rates of COVID. So we designed these treatments, ways of keeping people happy in quarantine, frankly. So that worked, which was really cool. There were also some externalities. On day 7, following the beginning of our research, the government of Italy adopted our recommendations, which was pretty neat. On day 9, they implemented our strategy nationwide to try to use the messaging we suggested and to design and to include the different ways of reducing the mental health impacts of the quarantine. Interestingly, on day 11, the United Nations asked to repeat our experiments in lots of other countries. So it was a really fun project to be able to be part of, and an important project and rewarding for us, and we hope the Italian people as well. One thing that we're particularly interested in is that the public is very willing to give so much of their data right now. We wanted a survey, we conducted a survey. People responded at very high levels. It's not often in surveys that people will just answer your questions, but here everybody answered the questions. They sent us the data with the names and addresses of everybody on it. Privacy is not in anybody's present views, but it's going to be. There's no question it's going to be. And the high level of collaboration and the high level of cooperation that's been going on during the COVID crisis is something I want to continue, because we still have plenty of other public health problems to conquer. And if we can keep up the level of cooperation, even when people start paying attention to privacy, we thought this is really something that would really be valuable. And so we started putting in place new privacy protections, differential privacy. Perhaps you've heard of that. I think you'll be talking about some of it later. The Census Bureau has implemented some of it. With Facebook, we have released 17 trillion numbers in one data set, the largest differentially private data set, maybe the largest social science data set ever. That solves differential privacy, makes it possible to take data, make it available in a totally privacy protected way for individuals. Despite the fact that the individual's privacy is protected, it's still possible to find patterns. So we're racing right now to put in place these privacy protections for these types of data and for other types of data around the world as well. So how do we empower the social sciences? How do we do it? 3 things. What 3 things? Connections between different sectors of society, from government to academia to industry. We need methods, new methods. We need existing methods, because big data is not about the data. It's about the analytics that make the data actionable. And third, it's about new questions. It can't be the case that we make the connections between the people in different sectors, we let data flow that use actionable methods, but we constrain the data analysts so much that they can't ask new questions. We need new connections, new methods, and new questions. So I really hope to hear from you all, because we can make some new connections, we can develop some new methods, and perhaps we can ask some new questions. Maybe we can even get some answers. That's where you can find some information about me. I'll see you soon.